What does grief really look like when the cameras stop rolling? When the spotlight fades and the only thing left in the room is silence, sorrow, and unanswered questions. For Scott Disick, grief was never just a private battle, it was a storm that shook every corner of his life. And in the midst of that storm, two figures stood firmly by his side: Kim Kardashian and Khloé Kardashian. Their bond, tested through years of family trials, business ventures, and personal challenges, became something more profound when Scott was forced to face his grief head-on. This isn't just another story about the Kardashians. This is a raw and unfiltered look into loyalty, family, and the kind of support that can mean the difference between breaking down and standing tall. I remember the moment clearly. The air felt heavy in the Kardashian household, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Scott Disick sat quietly, his hands clasped together, staring at the floor as if the answers to his pain were buried beneath the marble tiles. He had lost so much in his life: his parents, his sense of stability, and at times, even himself. Grief had been his constant shadow, but this moment was different. Today, he wasn't alone. Kim Kardashian and Khloé Kardashian were there. Not as reality stars, not as global icons, but as sisters who understood that grief isn't something you escape from, but something you walk through hand in hand. Kim leaned forward first, her voice steady yet filled with compassion. She reminded Scott of the strength he had already shown, how he had endured losses that would have broken most people. She didn't sugarcoat the pain. That wasn't Kim's way. She knew the cameras might capture this moment, but her words weren't for television. They were for Scott. She was helping him face his grief in real time, offering him the reassurance that he wasn't as alone as he sometimes felt. Khloé, on the other hand, carried the raw emotion that only she could bring. Her empathy had always been her strength. She wrapped Scott in it like a blanket, not pushing him to move on, but urging him to sit with his feelings, to let them breathe. Khloé Kardashian had been through her own heartbreaks, her own moments of despair, and she knew better than anyone that grief doesn't follow a timeline. She held his gaze and told him it was okay to feel broken, because sometimes that's where healing begins. The room was quiet except for their voices, low and steady. Scott shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was used to deflecting with humor, used to hiding behind sarcasm or bravado. But today, with Kim and Khloé there, he didn't need to perform. He didn't need to wear the mask of the Lord Disick persona. Instead, he could just be Scott, a man carrying the weight of grief on his shoulders, finally allowing others to help him hold it up. Grief had followed Scott Disick since his early adulthood. Losing both of his parents within just a few months was a wound that never fully healed. The pain came in waves, often striking when he least expected it. But the public saw only glimpses, filtered through episodes of Keeping Up with the Kardashians or scattered across tabloid headlines. What they didn't see was the quiet devastation, the sleepless nights, the isolation that comes when you feel like no one could possibly understand. That's where Kim Kardashian and Khloé Kardashian made the difference. They weren't just offering comfort, they were offering presence. Sometimes the most powerful act is simply showing up. As I watched, Kim gently placed her hand on Scott's arm. "We're not going anywhere," she told him. Those words lingered in the room. They carried weight. They weren't about fame or business or the empire the Kardashians had built. They were about humanity. They were about family. And in that moment, Scott's eyes flickered not with joy, not with sudden healing, but with the faintest glimmer of relief. Khloé leaned back, her voice breaking slightly as she said, "You've been through so much, Scott, more than most people could handle. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore. Not with us here." It was the kind of statement that goes beyond comfort. It was a lifeline. Scott nodded, unable to find words. For a man who had built his life on being quick-witted and outspoken, his silence said everything. I thought about how grief transforms people. For Scott Disick, it had stripped away layers of identity, forcing him to confront who he was without the people he loved most. But grief also has a way of revealing who stands by you when the world feels unbearably heavy. And for Scott, it was Kim and Khloé who refused to let him collapse under the weight. The three of them sat there for hours, the conversation ebbing and flowing. Sometimes Scott opened up, recalling memories of his parents, sometimes choking on the words. Sometimes he just sat in silence, and that was okay too. Kim and Khloé didn't T-push. They didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed. They simply allowed the grief to exist, reminding Scott through their presence that grief didn't mean being abandoned. As the evening turned to night, I realized this wasn't just a story about Scott Disick. It was a story about resilience, about the bonds that transcend fame, fortune, and the superficial narrative the world so often assigns to the Kardashian. Behind the glamour, behind the cameras, behind the carefully curated images on social media, there was something undeniably real unfolding here. Family helping, family through grief. Scott eventually broke his silence. His voice was low, strained. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to live with this grief." It was the kind of confession that takes courage, because vulnerability is terrifying, especially for someone who has built a reputation on confidence. Kim's response was steady, almost clinical in its clarity. "You don't do grief, Scott. You live with it, day by day, and some days will hurt more than others. But the point is, you're not doing it alone. That's why we're here." Her words echoed with a kind of wisdom that only comes from experience. Khloé reached across the space between them, her voice gentle but fierce. "And when you feel like you're drowning, we'll pull you back up, every single time." The truth about grief is that it doesn't disappear. It becomes a part of you, woven into the fabric of your life. For Scott Disick, facing his grief wasn't about erasing it, it was about learning to carry it differently. And with Kim and Khloé Kardashian by his side, he had the strength to try. As I left that room, I carried the weight of what I had witnessed. It wasn't a spectacle. It wasn't for the cameras. It was raw, unfiltered humanity. Kim Kardashian and Khloé Kardashian helping Scott Disick face his grief was not a headline, it was a testament to love, loyalty, and the power of showing up when it matters most. In the end, grief remains. It lingers in the quiet moments, in the memories, in the spaces where loved ones once stood. But so does love. So does support. And for Scott, knowing that Kim and Khloé would continue to stand by him made all the difference. This wasn't about healing in the traditional sense. It was about surviving, enduring, and finding light, even in the darkest of places. And that, perhaps, is the true story not just of Scott Disick's grief, but of how Kim and Khloé Kardashian helped him face it with courage, compassion, and the unshakable reminder that family, at its best, is forever.